Hello YouTube and welcome back to Java. This is tutorial number 13. I'm Nebus Mac Tutorials, and today we're going to be talking about how to make a chart or a table GUI element as a pop-up window. And so we're going to start with the basic code we had last time. And so if I run this real quick, it has an error but it won't affect this real quick. You'll see we have this window and we had a make file button, a delete file button, and a close program button. So if you click make file, it makes a cool file that is just a text file and it has Nebus Mac Tutorials written in it. Delete file, it removes that file. Close program, it closes the program. And address book is a new button that I added. And I'm not going to go much into depth as to what I changed in here because obviously it is stuff we've covered before. All it is a new button and creating an object. But I'll just point it out real quick. So we have a new button that we made, B4. We added a new action listener for B4. We added a new tooltip text for B4. And we added B4 to the GUI layout. And then also we added this else if address.equals. Remember, this address is coming from this action performed method. Action event E is referring in this case to a button click. So a person clicks the button and then it says, hey button, what was your action command? And this is the action command. It's whatever we set the action command to be. And it'll say, what's your action command? And it'll pull that in, and so if it's make, it creates the file. If it's delete, then it deletes the file. Else, it does closes the program. And we added a new one, which is if it is equal to address. And if it's equal to address, we create an address book object, and we call that, we call the method call, which is kind of redundant. So this is throwing us an error because this is kind of pretty much empty. And we need to add some stuff to it. We need to add a call method and a ton of other stuff. This is like 6 pages printed, so we're going to be typing a lot. I printed it out so I could have it here for reference. Yep, basically 6 pages full of text. So let's get started. First, our imports. We have javax.swing. That's for our swing GUI elements, like most of the GUI elements you'll see. We have AWT. AWT is useful for a lot of different things as well. AWT.event is for key listener events, and the other one is for button events. AWT.data transfer, we're going to be using that for transferring information into the table, stuff like that. And then java.io, that's for file input output, and then java.util, that's for, we're going to be using the scanner class. We're going to be making a scanner object, maybe even a couple scanner objects, I'm not sure. But yeah, I think it's just one. I could be wrong. But anyway, so that's what our imports do. And basically it's yelling at me right now because it's saying you must implement the inherited abstract method keyListener.keyReleased key event, and that's because I'm implementing keyListener here. If I took this out, it'd be like, oh boy, everything's wonderful, and then I put it back in and it's like, you suck. So anyway, we have our constructor here, and we gotta kind of fill out the constructor with some stuff. So real quick, as you can see from the time, which is probably like upwards of 40 minutes, I imagine. Obviously, I don't know the exact time, but probably somewhere around 40 minutes to an hour. This is going to be a very long tutorial because we're covering a lot of information. So just a quick run over of what we're covering, and go ahead and pause this and get comfortable. Basically, we're going to be covering 3 main areas. The first one is in order of kind of like probably how they're going to be explained. The first one is probably going to be the use of two-dimensional strings, or two-dimensional arrays, and the second one's going to be the use of tables, and the third one's going to be the tables in GUI elements, a table, and then the third one is going to be the use of key listeners. And so I'm pretty sure all 3 of those things are new to us. We have gone over arrays. Two-dimensional arrays just mean instead of calling, int myArray equals new int array 4, and then you call, int array or myArray 2, and it returns what's in position 3 because you start counting at 0, 0, 1, 2, that's the third cell. Instead of that, we're going to be having 2 dimensions, so you call it with a length and a width, for example. You can have arrays that are 3 dimensions, so you have a length, width, and height, or that are 4th dimensions, so technically it'd be height, length, width, and time, but honestly it's just 4 dimensions. You can have 8-dimensional arrays. There's really no point. If you're having an array that's more than 3 dimensions, you're probably doing something wrong. However, there are a couple specialized use cases where an 8-dimensional array would be useful, for example, in tables. If you have a bunch of dimensions of a table, it could be useful, but it could probably be done more efficiently. So we're going to be using a 2-dimensional array, which works I think, quite well for this. But anyway, let's get started. So in our constructor, we're going to call our super. Remember, calls to super always have to be the first line in your constructor. And we're going to call it with a new grid layout, 1, 1. 1, 1, grid layout is basically a layout that's a grid. It's, if you're familiar with like HTML tables, it's kind of a similar idea. And I haven't done much with HTML coding myself, honestly. I run a couple of websites and it's mostly static HTML and stuff. But basically, the idea of tables is that, you know, you have a table with length 3 and width 2, and so you have a total of 6 cells, and you can put things in those cells. And so grid layout works kind of like that, where you're basically setting up a grid of GUI elements, one by one, because all we're putting in there is a table. So that's just one. The table itself is considered a GUI element. Instead of each column being a GUI element, the whole table is an element, so that table takes up one box in our grid, essentially. So anyway, that's really not very important. It's just good to know why it's 1, 1 instead of anything else. 1, 0 would also work in that case, but 1, 1 is more logical. So then we're going to create a string array, and we're going to call it column names. And basically, we're making a address book application here. And so the two columns we want are name and address. Obviously, in a professional application, we'd have, you know, name, address, phone number, email address, zip code, state, country. We'd have a lot more. However, this is just a very simple tutorial on just how to use tables, how you go about using tables. So we're just going to do name and address to show how you do columns and such. And then, that's great. And then we're going to add key listeners to this. Remember, this is extending Jpanel. This. I gotta stop using the word this when I'm not using the keyword. That's gonna be very hard. Good thing there isn't the keyword that. There isn't, is there? No, there isn't. Alright, cool. But anyway, so our class address book extends Jpanel, and so we're adding action listeners to our Jpanel. So when that Jpanel is selected and someone presses the J key, our panel knows they pressed the J key. Now we're not going to do anything with the J key. We're going to be using C for copy and N for new, so you can add a new entry or you can copy an existing entry. However, it's still very good to understand, you know, what these key listeners are doing. So basically, it's just listening constantly for keyboard input while that window is selected. So that's what that does. And then we're going to create a file, f equals, and we're going to say it's a new file, and it's going to be called addressbook.txt. And that's where we're going to actually store the addresses, so they're persistent. When a user closes the program and reopens it, they're all still there. They're not a software level construct anymore. They are now a software level construct that's saved that we can refer to back on later. So we're going to have our file called addressbook.txt, and we're going to store the name and then the address, name, address, name, address. So every other line is a name, every other line is an address, essentially. So just for a quick example, say we have a name Todd, and he lives on 8204 Bridge Road, whatever. And then we'd have Rod, and he lives on 8203 Bridge Road. And so Todd and Rod live together because they have similar names, so of course they live together. Well, close to each other. And basically, 8204 and 8203 would be our addresses, and you can notice that's this is line 0, this is line 1, line 2, and line 3. So let me just add that real quick here. 0. This is just explaining how our file management is going to work. It's really not imperative to the tutorial, but it's just to explain why this is working. So lines 0 and 2, or even numbered lines, would have the name, and odd numbered lines would have the address for the name above them. So line 1 has the address for the name in line 0. Line 3 has the address for the name in line 2, like that. So basically, if our file's number of lines are not divisible by 2, we're going to have a problem. However, the program is going to make sure that it doesn't do stupid stuff like that, so unless the user is screwing around with the file, we're probably good to go. So anyway, add action listeners, it's yelling at us because it's like, what, you don't have add key listeners, blah 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 blah. The reason is because it's not plural. So anyway, so we're going to say if f does not exist, so basically if the file addressbook.txt isn't there, so it's like the first time they've opened it, or they just re-downloaded it, or they deleted the address book and want to start over, whatever they did, we're going to do a try clause with a catch, and we're just going to catch exception E, and we're going to do system.out.println error creating new file, and we should put that there. Of course. Just a second. That's an escape key. So, or an escape character. This by itself is an escape character, so that signals that this together is a double quote. I think I covered that before. So if you have two, that escapes it to an actual backslash instead of the forward slash, which is that. Backslash is the one that on, oops, didn't mean to press insert, that on a standard QWERTY keyboard in the United States is right under the backspace key and right above the enter key. It's usually to the left of the delete key and to the right of the right bracket / right brace key. So anyway, that's that key. That's just to make an emoticon for being sad. Basically, if we don't have the file, we want to do print writer out equals new print writer, and we're going to want to do it based on the file, and out.close. We really don't want to save anything to the file right now because they haven't put any addresses in. We just want to have the file there. And so after that, we're going to, next page, we're going to create a scanner object. So outside of our if statement, scanner scan equals new scanner, and we're going to scan in error. The thing is, we're going to set the scanner to something new, and if that has an error, then error is going to be put somewhere inside of the table. So it's kind of like a all-in-one safety solution precaution thingy. So anyway, inside of here, we're going to try. We're going to make a try block, and we're going to try to set scan equal to a new scanner of file F. And so, just to explain real quick, I think I didn't explain this error properly. Scanner right now is working from a string called error, and if this for some reason fails, setting it to this file, then later on when we scan from it to flow it into the table, one of the table elements is going to say error in all caps, so someone knows that something wrong happened. So that's why we're scanning from error. This is replaced if the file is set up properly, if the scan object is able to get the scanner to scan the file addressbook.txt. So that's there. This really isn't necessary. This is just kind of like a cool little thing. Try and then catch exception E and system.out.println you has dem errors or whatever. So anyway, inside of here, all we're going to do inside of our try block is we're going to create a new scanner object, and then down here we're going to flow that in to a brand new one-of-a-kind, where did I put my first sheet of paper? Sorry, my brand new one-of-a-kind array. And so first we got to create the array, and actually we have a couple class variables to take care of real quick. So public class key listener, we're going to have, what am I doing there? We're going to have a private boolean debug equals false. Don't really need this, but it's kind of a cool feature. Private static jframe frame, which is going to be our main frame. Our main frame. The primary frame for our application that we're going to be putting the table in. It's the frame that this grid layout is basically set into, if you want to think about it that way. We're going to have a private JTable, that's the actual table GUI element. We're going to have a private array list of type string, and we're going to call it data1. And finally, we're going to have a private JScrollPane, in case it's bigger than the window, longer than the window as far as the entries. It'll be a scroll pane that we'll be using, so they can scroll inside of it, which is all cool and dandy, except I misspelled private. That's not cool and dandy. So anyway, data1 is an array list, and we're going to be using that right here. And so going back to my second page here, basically we're going to set it equal to a new array list. And if any of this isn't familiar to you as far as like array lists, those kind of things, you need to understand these to continue. So if you don't know what they are, go back to a couple videos back and I talk about array lists and to more length than you'd probably care to know. So anyway, go back to there if you don't know what array lists are. And I think it's like tutorial 8 or 9 or something, I don't know. But anyway, so data1, we're making a new array list of type string, and data1's going to start just being basically a, nice little drawing board on which to draw things. So we're going to do a while loop, and so while scan.has next line, so while our file addressbook.txt has another line, hopefully 2, we're going to do data1.add scan.next line, and we could do another one, scan.next line, and that cut the amount of while loops in half because we know it's going to be divisible by 2 anyway, but this ensures from it throwing a no line found error because it wouldn't be calling 2 lines when it only knows for sure that it has 1. So this is kind of a safety measure, so it'd say, you know, hey, error, unable to, instead of spitting out errors, we can handle that later on in the program. So don't worry about that. So while we have a new line in our file, we're going to add that new line to our array list, and then we're going to create our 2-dimensional array. So let me just put out the syntax real quick, and then I promise I'll explain it. So we're going to create a new 2-dimensional array of objects called data, and it's going to be a new object array, and the size, one of the sizes is going to be data1.size divided by 2 plus 1, and I'll explain that in just a second, and the second one's going to be 2. And then data 0, 0 is going to be set equal to press A to add an entry, and data 0, 1 is going to be equal to select an address and press C to copy. And so, let's explain real quick how 2-dimensional arrays work. Basically, a 2-dimensional array is defined just like a 1-dimensional array, except it has 2 of these. And when you construct it, you have to give it both a length and a width, or length and a height, or whatever, length and time, whatever you want, to call it 2 different dimensions. And so data1.size divided by 2 plus 1. Why do we use that? This is not really related to the GUI elements or anything like that, just plain math. Data1 contains name, address, name, address, name, address, name, address. So if there's 4 names, there are 4 names and 4 addresses. This data1 contains all of them on a new line, so it'd have 8 entries. So everything seems cool. So we have 8, and then we divide it by 4, and we get 4, right? And then we have to add 1 to add the extra line where we're going to put this information. So that's why we add 1. And then this 2 is just saying how many columns we have. So you can think of this as basically how many rows we have, and this is how many columns in our table. There's a direct correlation between those. And I've already been talking for almost 20 minutes, and we haven't even gotten to the cool part. But anyway, so we set data 0, 0 to press A to add an entry, and 0, 1 to select an address and press C to copy. So explaining real quick how this object array kind of relates to the table real quick. If we have a table, and say we have, you know, that, and of course you're going to underline it all ugly. But basically, say we have 4 of these. This is line 0. I didn't set this up right. Just a second. Sorry. This is column 0. This is column 1. This is line 0. And this is just an explanation of how this is working. This is line 3, line 2, line 1. So, alright, there we go. Wait, no. Never mind. Alright, anyway, but basically what you have here is you have a 2-dimensional array, so you have columns, and you have rows. And so column 0 would be this column here. Row 0 would be this row here. So it would be referring to this blank. And that 0 shouldn't be there. It would be referring to this blank here. And setting this blank equal to press A to add an entry. And then it's saying 0, 1, 0, so we're still talking about row 0, but we're talking about column 1 this time. So row 0, column 0. Row 1, column 0 is right here. And that's going to be where we're putting select an address and press C to copy. So if this was our table setup in our actual GUI, this would be how it's set up. Press A to add an entry would be our first line here, and select an address and press C to copy would be our first line here. Then we'd have addresses, or then we'd have, sorry, name and address. So that's how everything's going to be set up here. That has nothing to do with the actual programming, that's just the logic behind it. Although logic has a lot to do with programming. So basically, we're going to create an int counter real quick, and the counter object is going to be used mostly to just make sure that we're hitting the right line. So we're going to do a for loop for int I equals 0, I is less than data1.size. Remember, that's our array list. So we don't use data1.length, we use data1.size, and I plus plus. Actually, I plus equals 2 because we have name and address that we're putting in, so we have to iterate over 2 and 2 and 2 at a time. This is where we're going to throw an error if it's not an even amount. This is where it's going to go, whoa, 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 hold on a second, something's wrong. And so this is where that would be taken care of. I'm not going to bother with doing try catch and throwing an error for no new line on a scanner object. You can do that if you want, but this is just a demo application. But that's how you do it. You do a try-catch block around it, and you catch an exception somewhere along the lines of a scanner's object not having another line. But anyway, so in our for loop, we're going to want to set data counter and 0. Remember, this is the line, so counter would be the row, and so as we go up from 0, we're going to want to. Actually, this starts at 1 because this was 0. This would be basically, this counter would go right here, and then we're going to do counter 0, and then data counter 1 equals, and then data to get I, and I plus 1. So let's do that real quick. Data1.get I, and this is confusing, and so I'm going to try to explain this, but you might just look at it and it's like, oh yeah, of course that makes sense. Or it might be like, what is going on here? So let me just take some time to explain this. If you don't want to hear this explanation, try skipping ahead like a minute or so. So, to 23 minutes. But basically, anyway, your counter object, each time you run this for loop, is going to count up 1. And let's add that real quick. Counter plus plus. And so counter's going to increment by 1 every time you run this for loop. And we could do it as a function of I, but that's too much work and I'm lazy. So I made a separate variable. And counter is going to count lines. It starts at 1 because line 0, or row 0 if you want to call it, row 0 of your table is taken up with this wonderful information. So line 1 is going to be where you're going to start adding in the addresses from the file. And so we've already gotten the file's contents put into an array list, and we now got to flow that array list into this two-dimensional object array, so that then we can feed that two-dimensional object array into the table when we run the table's constructor. And so hopefully that makes sense, and this is because this is column 0 and this is column 1. So the left column and then the right column, left is 0, right is 1. So welcome back if you skipped ahead to 23 minutes. We just finished explaining, and that was like perfect timing, about how this is working. So we also added this increment for counter because every time this for loop runs, you are going to want to count up counter 1, and you could do it as a function of I, you know, add 1 to I and divide by 2 or whatever, but you'll get some messy stuff going on, so it's easier to just make a separate variable. Not impossible to do it as a function of I and save on 2 lines of code, but you're going to end up having to do a lot more work, and it's probably not going to work quite as well anyway. So anyway, moving on. After our for loop, now is when we're going to create our table. So table equals, and we already have our table, remember, declared up here. It just isn't set to anything yet. It's not initialized. So table equals new JTable, and we're going to construct it with data and column names. Sorry, spelling escapes me tonight, so just typing apparently. So data is our object array, our two-dimensional object array, and column names is defined up here as a one-dimensional string array. And so that's pretty simple. This is the harder part. You has them errors. We should add an H. So once you create your table, the table by default when you construct it, you want to give it a two-dimensional, well, at least in this case, a two-dimensional object array and a one-dimensional column name array. And so really this would be like line or row -1, but it's considered like kind of a header, so it doesn't count in the counting of lines. We'll talk more about that later when we're actually getting information from the table, or trying to get it anyhow. So anyway, we're going to during our table construction actually create a new method for our table. It's basically creating a table object and extending it. That's kind of the same logic that's going on here, but it's slightly different. But basically a public boolean, we're overriding one of the methods already in there, is cell editable, int row, int call, and really no matter what they pass to it, we're going to return false. And so is cell editable, why is that not working? Is cell editable, illegal modifier, only final is permitted. Public boolean, I didn't fix it. Let's look up here real quick. This may have had to be private static JFrame frame, private JTable table. Anyway, let's just continue real quick and see if that fixes itself. Only final is permitted. Oh, alright, that works. Return false, and it says you cannot return a value. And so, public boolean address book, and it's like, you still can't do that. Basically, maybe if we take off this, then this will want public. There we go. Sorry about that. I was being stupid, as usual. But anyway, basically, when we make our table, we're telling it, hey, I want to make a table, but I want to override one of your methods, and that method is cell editable. And I can't believe I did that with that semicolon. I feel like an idiot. But anyway, I'm saying I want to override this method. And you can do this with object creation. It's kind of a more advanced thing you don't see much except with GUI elements and like elements with networking and things like that. But basically you're saying, hey, you know, I like you, but I want to change something, so you override a method. That was a bad analogy. But anyway, moving on. We're going to add a key listener to our table, and we're going to do table.set preferred scrollable viewport size. Don't you just love how concise some of their Java names are for methods? Oh, new dimension 520. 500, and that's just kind of the sweet spot for what we're doing, I think. You can edit these, of course, to change it based on what your application needs. These are just kind of default values that I'm using here because I've tested this before and this is what works. For me, I don't know. It's also pretty universal. You're not going to find screens smaller than about 500 by 500 pixels, and really, if you find one that small, let me know. I want to buy it as an antique. But honestly, you're rarely going to see a screen that's under, like, about 640 by 480, I think. You're really not going to see screens like that. So that's a very safe, guaranteed to fit on every screen kind of window. So anyway, moving on. We also want to do table.set fills viewport height true. What does this do? Well, basically, it sets whether or not this table is always made large enough to fill the height of an enclosing viewport. But basically, it's saying, do I stretch to fit our dimension? That's the guts of it, although they like to explain it in, like, paragraphs. And I like paragraphs too, but not that much. So basically, now we're going to bring in our debug variable. So if debug, then we're going to want to make a table. We're going to want to add a mouse listener to the table, a new mouse adapter, and I'm not going to go much into trying to explain this code because honestly it doesn't really matter very much. It's just here for kind of debugging purposes. So public void mouse clicked, mouse event e, and then we have our another one of these, and print debug data table, and it's going to be like, what, the method print debug is undefined for the type new mouse adapter. And basically, if we were to go in and try to fix all this code and get everything working all nicely, all this would do is, if you have debug enabled, it would go in and try, attempt to basically print out the debug data for what you clicked on. I'm actually going to ignore this method for now because I don't think it's useful. However, in more advanced applications, something like that would be useful. So, just heads up. But anyway, I'm going to skip right over that. We basically want to make a scroll pane and add that to the table. So, scroll pane, very original naming, equals new J scroll pane with the contents of table. So we're adding table into a scroll pane, and then we're going to add scroll pane, and that's assumed that this is the method add from up here when we extend Jpanel. That's the add method in Jpanel, and we're adding a scroll pane, and so that scroll pane is basically a table plus a scroll bar. And so a scroll pane is like, imagine this box that's pretty much empty except it has a scroll bar, and then you plop a table into that empty space. That's what our scroll pane is, and then once we have that scroll pane, it's plopping that GUI element, those combined GUI elements together, into a into a Jpanel, not a J-frame. That's the actual window the user sees. So more going on behind the scenes than you might think there would be. So that's interesting. We're going to have another... basically the reason our debug didn't work is because we didn't have the method print debug data, and we could write that, but basically all it does is parses through the table to get the information at that data point and print it out in an easy to read format. That's why our previous one didn't work. There was no method designed for that yet. We had to make it. But I'm not going to bother with that. Like I said, we're already running over 30 minutes and we haven't even gotten to the fun part. So skipping right over our print debug, we're going to override a key released method. And you might be wondering why we're not overriding key pressed. It's because it's generally better user experience for you to release the key before it starts doing stuff than for it to happen while you're pressing it. Obviously that doesn't apply to things like video games where we want the user, you want the user to be able to press a button and have stuff going while they're holding it. However, for our purposes, this application is going to be easier when the user releases the key, because it's a nicer experience. Click release and everything's done, instead of click and then it's doing it and doing it and doing it and doing it and doing it. So we're just going to be overriding the key released method. We will be overriding the key pressed method, however it's going to be empty. So anyway, public void key released key event e. So this is whenever the user presses a key on their keyboard, like whenever they try to misspell public. And so we're going to create a character, and we're going to call it just like temp. And we're going to set it to e.getKeyChar, and so that's the key that's pressed. So what the key event e.getKeyChar is saying, hey, key event, what key was pressed and is now released that you were spawned from? Was it C? Was it V? Was it backspace? Was it shift? What key was this? And so it's going to set that into a character object, and that's just called temp, sorry. And then we're going to say if temp is equal to A or temp is equal to capital A, just to kind of cover ourselves. And then we're going to want to do a couple of things. So basically up here we said, where'd it go? Here it is. Press A to add an entry. So if they pressed A, we want to do the function of adding an entry. So we're going to pop up a JOption pane, which is basically a little window, and it says basically please enter the name you want for the new entry, and it has a little box to enter. You can type it in and press OK, or continue or something of that nature, and then we're going to then ask for the address. So we're going to be using two JOption panes to get information. Then we're going to be putting it into the table. Then we're going to be killing that table and starting up a new one with the new data in it, because it's easier to do that than update a table, interestingly enough. So, if they pressed A, we're going to want to create a string called name, and we're going to want to set that equal to what a JOption pane dot show input dialog frame, please enter the name you want for the new entry, and blurb. And so then basically the way this will work at this point is it would bring up a little window, and this, when it's done, returns something. If the user clicks cancel, it returns null. So then we're going to want to say if it's not equal to null, then we want to get an address. If it is equal to null, then we could care less. Let's just ignore their key press and move on and wait for another one. So if name is equal to null, So if name is not equal to null, and let's put this in parentheses again, and they're going to be like, what's this equals to null stuff? I bet you anything. No, they're not. Alright, cool. Didn't even have to explain that. So anyway, if the name is not equal to null, that's what the exclamation mark means. It means inverse. So name equals null returns true. Then this whole thing evaluates to false because of this. This reverses it. True to false, false to true. This is a Boolean statement, and so it's saying if this Boolean is equal to true. So if this evaluates to false, then this would evaluate it to true, so then the if statement would run. Kind of backwards logic there. So if the name is not equal to null, so if we actually did enter a name instead of clicking cancel, then we want to do string address equals, and then basically the exact same thing. JOption pane.show input dialog frame, and please enter the address for, and then we'll insert name into there, plus a period mark, and a period. JOption pane is getting mad at me because I didn't capitalize my P. Whoa, don't put it there. There we go. Alright, cool. So if they click cancel, then address would be equal to null. So if then address is not equal to null, like that, then what do we do? If we have both a name and an address, then we want to add it to our table. But instead of adding it to the table and updating the table and blah blah blah, all that fun stuff, we're going to just add it back to the file and then close the window and open up a new one with the new information added, which really isn't as big of a problem as it sounds like. So data1.add name and data1.add address. Remember, data1 was our original array list with everything in it. Well, now we just added something new to it. And then we're going to try, and not always succeed, but try, to make a print writer, call it out again, equals new print writer, new file, address book.text. And so everything's fine and dandy, and except that I misspelled print. Oh, N-T. There we go. And so we're going to try to create a print writer, and let's just run our catch real quick. Catch, exception, E, and let's do println error, writing new file, saving changes. Okay, and we have to spell catch properly for it to work. But anyway, back to what I was saying. What is it? Oh, alright, duplicate parameter, whatever. E1, or catch exception D, or whatever you want to call it. I like E1 better. Or E2. Yeah, E1. Sorry. Print writer out. So we create a new print writer, and we're going to save all that information to the file again. And so we're going to do for int I equals 0, I is smaller than data1 dot size I plus plus, and we're just going to print out our array list to a file. That's going to get all mad at us probably. And then we fix it by adding in our proper bracing. And so basically, out.println data1.get I. And we of course need our punctuation here, out.println. And so we're printing out all of the contents of data1 to a file. So we read in all the file, then we added 2 more lines, and we're printing that all out to the file again. So obviously if you had an address book with 100,000 people, you might have a little bit of a delay here, but otherwise you'll be fine. 1,001, you'll be fine. 100,001. No, but if a user's going to have that big of an address book, they're probably not going to be using this kind of an application anyhow. But anyway, out.println data1.get I. And then once we're done with that, we're going to create a new thread. Actually, let's do out.close first. Out.close. Then close. There we go. And we're going to want to create a new thread. Thread T equals new thread. And we already closed stuff. Already closed our out. So that file is written and everything's good and done. If we close the application right now and reopened it, everything would be saved and fine. However, we don't want that to happen. We then want to make a new address book. Address book new table equals new address book. So it's creating an instance of itself. And then new table dot call. Ooh, and the call method is still missing. We still haven't written the call method yet. We're going to do that in just a second. And so basically at this point we can do frame, and this is referring to itself, my frame, not the new one, but my frame, dot set default close operation. You're going to find that with Java GUI stuff, the names are ridiculously long for some things. It's like, what? You have to like take 4 looks at them and then copy and paste because you just give up on remembering it. But anyway, frame.setDefaultCloseOperation, jframe.disposeOnClose. At least this one rhymes. And then frame.setVisibleFalse. So basically what this is essentially doing is effectively closing itself and starting up another instance of itself. So it's hiding its own window and it's disposing on closing, which basically just gets rid of that window, and it's just hiding itself, and then it pops up the new window. So this is kind of like technically running, but it's not shown to the user and it's not hogging resources or anything like that really, so no one really cares. But for good memory management at some point, you could always kill this process. Honestly, you don't really need that, but it is a possibility, something you could consider if this was actually a professional application. So anyway, newtable.call is underlined because we haven't written the call method yet. And so once we catch our exception and print out stuff, we want to go all the way down 4 of these to else if temp equals C or temp, oops, what am I saying, temp equals capital C. And so this is then instead, if they didn't press A, they instead press C, then we're going to copy it to the clipboard. And so this involves Java getting control over the user's clipboard, which isn't actually as hard as you'd think. It's one of the things Java makes fairly easy. So we're going to want to create an int I and set it to table.getSelectedRow. And so basically we want to get the row that they selected, and then if I is greater than 0, because if it's equal to 0 we don't want to copy the instructions, they don't need that. We subtract 1 from I minus minus. The reason is because getSelectedRow, however cool it is, starts counting from 1, so we have to subtract 1 from it. And then you do string add equals data1.get I times 2 plus 1. And so basically here we're multiplying by 2 because if it's the 4th entry, it's really the 8th element in data 1, and then we're adding 1 because we had to subtract 1 up here. And then toolkit equals toolkit.getDefaultToolkit. This is all for getting control of the system keyboard. And then clipboard equals toolkit.getSystemClipboard. Then string selection, str selection, equals new string selection add. Remember, add refers to this or up here, a string selection. And then we set clipboard contents to be the string selection. And here we put null. So there's a lot of code. Let's explain it. So toolkit is not actually very useful in this instance, and we may be able to delete it. We'll see. Clipboard, or not delete it, but kind of like just hide that somewhere else. But you could leave it here. Honestly, toolkit is kind of this main overall thing of a lot of the tools on the system, one of which is the clipboard. So you get the clipboard from the toolkit, and then you set the clipboard to a string selection. Now, string selection, let's see if they want to explain it. String selection, what? Oop. They didn't want to explain it. Basically, string selection is exactly how it sounds. It's a string selection, a selection of a string, part of a string, and we're making the string selection of add, which is already a string. The reason is, which is kind of silly, clipboard wants a string selection object instead of a string, because a string selection is a transferable. It extends transferable. And transferable, let's see if they want to explain transferable. They don't. Basically, that's involved with data transfer with the table. But basically, I was hoping for more elegant one from them, but whatever. And then null, it's who owns the clipboard, and we just want the current user, so we send it null, and it knows we're talking about the current user. So anyway, if I is greater than 0, then I minus minus, and so if you think about this logically, if you want row 1, then you subtract 1 from it to get 0, then you multiply that by 2 to get 0, then you add 1, and that would be the first address in data 1. Now let's try without the subtraction. Int I equals table.getSelectedRow, so say we selected, again, row 1. So then we go into here with row 1. 1 times 2 gives you 2, plus 1 equals 3. That would be the second address, because 0, 1, 2, 3. That would be the second address, not the first. And you're kind of like, well, isn't it kind of redundant to subtract and then add add 1 to I? It seems kind of silly. And the first time I did this, it took me like 20 minutes to figure out that I need to do this, because I kept getting 1 off. And finally I just did it just to get rid of the 1 off, this, and I was like, oh my god, it works. And then I thought about it, and it's like, oh, now it makes sense. Because honestly, since you're multiplying by 2, if this is 1 for like the first row, you're going to have an issue, so you got to subtract from it, so you get 0 times 2, which is 0, plus 1, which is the first address. So anyway, that's out of the way. That's kind of confusing, but just go with it. And my thing's kind of lagging. Make sure I save. Basically, so we have our else if statement, and everything's all ready to go. It's probably still yelling at us. The type address book must implement the inherited abstract method keyListener.keyPress blah blah blah. And that's because we're only using key released, but we do have to use key pressed. So just so it'll feel happy, public void key pressed key event e blah blah blah, and then if I could spell public right, public key pressed key event e. And then you go up here, and it's still yelling at us about call. You go up here, and it's still yelling at us about this. Why? Because you have to have the key typed method. So we'll also have public void key typed key event e. And now everything should be all happy. But of course, it still wants keyListener.keyTyped, because it's like, you don't really have it, because we don't have a capital T. Now it's all happy, except for not having the call method. So let's create, first of all, let's create a create and show GUI method. So public static void create and show GUI, and then we're going to call this method from the call method, which is really bad naming. I shouldn't have named it call. But anyway, frame equals new JFrame address book. This is where we actually construct our JFrame, and this is like one of the first things that's called. And then we do frame dot set default close operation, jframe.exit on close, which we'll later overwrite, but we want it to be this for now. And so then we got to basically do kind of an introspective object creation with address book new content pane equals new address book, like that. And we're already at almost 15 minutes. I knew this would be a long tutorial. And then we have to use our new content pane to set whether we want it opaque. A content pane has to be opaque. Just something that's kind of a given. Set opaque. If you don't know what opaque means, it means basically it's the opposite of translucent, letting light through. So in computer terms, it's basically visible. Is it visible? Can you see it? So you could make one that's not opaque, but what's the point? There could be some uses, but not in this case. You could use it if you want a window to be doing something, but you want it hidden for like certain debugging purposes, or you want it hidden because of some user option to not show advanced console, but you don't want to write separate chains of logic for having the console, not having the console, things like that. You can use that for. So set opaque can be based on a user selection or whatever. But anyway, moving on. Frame.set content pane to, well, new content pane. And content pane, let's see how well they explain it. New content pane. Basically, new content pane was an object of address book, but you have to set the content pane as itself, so that's like what's in here. So it's saying, hey, we have our self in here. What? So basically, it's a kind of an introspective object creation that's a content pane that's added to a JFrame, which is kind of confusing, or Jpanel, sorry, which is kind of confusing. But if you think about the logic, it's putting itself, a version of itself, inside of the JFrame, or sorry, Jpanel that it's making. So it makes sense. So after you create and show your GUI, we have a couple more methods, a couple more lines to put in here first. Frame.pack. Let's see how it explains the pack method. I'm curious. Causes this window to be sized for the preferred size, blah, blah, blah. Basically what it's doing is it's, remember our 520 by 500? It's saying, hey, fit the window to that exact size of your contents. Find out how big your contents are and the optimal window size to show them all. Yay! That's not trying to get rid of the scroll pane, that's just trying to fit the entire table inside the window, so the window doesn't have one white space below the table, or to the side of the table, and two, part of the table cut off. So, you need to pack it, and then, you don't need to, but it's suggested. Frame.setVisible true. You shouldn't honestly really have to do this, but you do. So you set the visibility, and then you set the default close operation to jframe.hide on close, which we actually makes this kind of redundant. We don't need this. This jframe exit on close kills the program. Hide on close hides the window. So we can take that out and we'll still be fine. And finally, we get to write, well, not finally, but one of the last things, second last method, is our call method, public static void call. Our program can finally stop yelling at us. So, the call method is going to invoke later a new runnable, and that runnable is going to override the method run and call create and show GUI. Let me type it out and then attempt to explain it. javax.swing utilities.invoke later new runnable, like that. And then inside of here we'll put public void run. We're going to override the run method, just like we overrode another method earlier. And show GUI. Create and show GUI is a method that we have right here. And then it's going to get mad at us out here because, one, we don't have this parenthesis, and two, we don't have this. And then it's still not happy. Let's see, new runnable. There we go. I was closing parentheses too early. So basically, invoke later is essentially saying, it says causes do run.run to be executed asynchronously on the AWT event dispatching thread. It's basically, hey, AWT, when you start making your GUI things, I'm going to start doing this. So it's synchronizing everything in your program kind of together so that the GUI creation happens at the same time. And it's kind of like when convenient or when appropriate. It handles appropriation of resources for starting up GUI elements for you. That's essentially what it does, although they like to explain it really confusing. Method should be used when an application thread needs to update the GUI, or create a GUI in this case. And it's using a new runnable. Let's see what it says about runnable. The interface is designed to provide a common protocol for objects at which execute code while they are active. It's implemented by the class thread. It's kind of the logic of a thread. A new runnable object is having a method run that's create and show GUI. A new runnable, we're using that mostly because of this invoke later. We need to invoke it later, invoke when appropriate with synchronization with AWT and AWT's GUI object creation. So we need to synchronize them, and so in order to use invoke later, we're going to want to use a new runnable object and override run to create and show GUI, which is what we want to do when AWT is ready. A very long logic chain. I'd suggest probably watching the last minute over again, if that doesn't make sense. But this is probably one of the most confusing lines in the entire program. So we got the call method done. It can stop yelling at us. And finally, we're going to have our main... and we actually don't honestly need a main class. It's just kind of if you wanted to start this on its own without the GUI before it's starting it. So I'm not going to put a main method in, but we could. So anyway, let's save and save over here. And finally, all our errors go away. And we run this. Our address book, and ta-da! Now, as you see, I already have some information in the file entered. from my previous test. This is showing how it would load in from an existing file. And so if I press A to add an entry, this is that J option pane, or J input pane, input dialog, whatever. And this is that pop-up window I was talking about. And so this asks what's the name I want for the new entry. So say it was the best Mac tutorials. And then it wants me to enter the address. And notice this frame is not resizable, as well as this frame, which I'll show you in just a second. Please enter the address. Let's see. 8247 Runner Avenue, Switzerland. I don't know what the Switzerland addresses look like. I don't really care. And I misspelled runner. Runny. Okay, and see it close that other window and open up a new one, and that new one has this information here. And if we press C to copy, so just click on that, press copy, or actually just click on the row, it by default assumes you're trying to copy the address, not the name. So wherever on here you're, and that's the way we coded it. We coded it to get the row selected and then choose the second column for what to copy. So whether you're clicked on this or this, it just matters what row you're clicked on. Press C, and it should be copied. B, and whoa, there it is. So let's try that again just to make sure everything's working. Let's close that and kill that. Let's run this again. Address book. Let's create a new one. A Jerry Ryan's Field. Random name. Please enter the address. 3200 Runny Road, Japan. Japani. Whatever. Spelled Japan wrong. And press copy and come over here, and sure enough, there's the address. So real quick, here's the address book file. As you can see, there is a enter line here. That's simply because if you look over here, while I was playing around, one of these lines I entered a name as having no data in it, no characters. And so at first it's kind of like, well, wouldn't that return null? Null is different from 0. Null is different from no characters. Null means nothing. No characters just means there's no characters. It's an empty string. Not a null. There is a difference. So anyway, if I want to edit this file, say put Patrick Montoya, and his address is in a box, and save this, you can see that editing that file will affect what we have from here. So Patrick Montoya in a box. And the reason that works is because that's reading all the information in from this address book.txt flat file here. This is an example of doing your own database, and of course this is a very simple database, a database that's only storing, like, you know, text and 2 lines of text, and then 2 more lines and 2 more lines, and very predictable and very straightforward and logical. One thing I want to point out real quick is, what if I delete one of these lines? What happens? And so let me save that real quick, and let me kill this program. And let me just make sure it's saved that properly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We have 7 lines, an odd number of lines. So if we run this and we click on address book, boom, we get thrown errors. Why? Because array index out of bounds exception. Inside of the scanner object, at some point it's using an array to access information, and so when we try to get number, in this case 4, interestingly enough, it's saying, whoa, 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 no, there's nothing there, I don't have a next line, it's just not there, sorry. And that's basically what is going on in here. So if the user edits the file improperly and doesn't have multiple lines, then they're going to have an issue with this. However, the program itself is probably never going to run into an error where it writes an odd number of lines, and so to that effect, everything should be completely fine in here as far as our program goes, assuming the user doesn't go and tries to meddle with our precious address book file. As you notice, if I add another line, it won't make sense, but the program will think it makes sense. Obviously, that's an address, not a name, but since that's our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th line, that's what it puts for a name, and then 2 was our next line, so that's what it thinks is an address. Obviously, the computer isn't smart to the effect that it can say, that looks like an address, that should be over here, wait, why is 2 there, let's swap them. You could make it to recognize addresses by saying, you know, does it have a number followed by a string or something like that, but even then, if someone wanted to have a name that had a number and then a string for some reason, then you could have conflicts within the program. So smart coding like that may actually be a hindrance. Just an interesting thing to mention. So real quick, I want to mention that this is stretchable. However, since we use .pack, this extends to where we want it to go. And if we make it really small, we have a scroll bar in here. So let's just real quick, for a proof of concept, put into, whoa, I already had that open. Whoa, don't open Photoshop, dang it. Say I wanted just tons of this. I have tons of addresses in here. Close that. No, Photoshop, go away. No one wants you, you're drunk. Address book, as you can see, we have a ton of names and a ton of addresses. And so we can scroll through them, and we have this little nice scroll bar. And Photoshop's going to pop up here. Badly timed click. Badly placed click. So anyway, if you see, if I shrink this, it's going to resize the table to fit everything in properly. So that's one of the nice useful features. It's going to stretch the table. So the user, if they have addresses that are really, really, really long, they can stretch the table to accommodate their needs. So because we use .pack, it automatically resizes the table to try to fit the size of the Jpanel, this outside box here. So anyway, that was a more than an hour-long tutorial. I'm sorry it went that long, and come to think of it, I probably should have broken it up into 3 tutorials, but I didn't, so oh well. Thank you for joining me. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments below. Both these files will be uploaded to Mediafire. There will be links to them in the description below. Yeah, the description below. I wanted to say the description at the side. What the heck? The description below. And one real quick announcement. I do have a Minecraft server up. So if anyone wants to hop on and play vanilla, or not vanilla, but like non-tech or anything like that, you don't require any client mods. Minecraft 1.4.2. The address to the server and the port is also in the description below. It's run on a low-end VPS with Intel Xeon 1230 V2 processor, 4 cores, 2 gigabytes of RAM, 50 gigabytes of disk space, and 500 gigabytes of bandwidth a month server. So those are the specs and the interesting, relevant things about it. And so anyway, I'd be happy to see you on it. Basically, it's not a cracked server, so it requires regular paid Minecraft, but it doesn't require any client-side mods, so just start up Minecraft. If you have an updated, update, and hop on. And I will see you next time, and if you have any questions, like I said, just leave them in the comments below.